Well, tēnā tata katoa. Thanks for coming here today to hear about next steps the government will be taking in the Three Waters program. But first, I'm mindful that we've all got a story about water. Water connects us to a time, a place, a memory, an emotion, a family occasion. We're getting to the end of the year, and I'm pretty sure many whānau will feel like they need a holiday. They'll go to their favourite beach, maybe lake or river, and it's such a common thing for Kiwi holidays. Just over the hill from where I live, I can remember when I was a new MP, there was a lot of local community advocacy around the situation out there. The community was really concerned about discharge coming from a wastewater pipe going into the harbour. Years of hard-fought advocacy and frustration because of that discharge going into the harbour impacted on the way the community saw themselves and what was important. The ability to gather kai from the harbour, to go and swim in the harbour, to be able to enjoy recreational activity, not just for those living in that community, but for many of us who lived over the hill. Yet their frustration in lobbying council to do something about it took years and years of inaction to actually get something to move. I think we're at a point now where that same community will be able to reflect and say, yes, there has been movement, but gosh, it took a long time. And I don't think that story is too dissimilar from many communities around the country. But let me tell you another story, a place where I have taken my children for the last 3 Christmases to celebrate. It's up in the far north. It's a place where, close to my mother's people, we enjoy staying by the side of the beach. However, every year when I've taken my children up there, we've also had to take our drinking water because that community cannot rely on the bore source that is available to them. And further afield up north, in the far north, there is a community that is on a permanent boiled water notice. There are several other parts of the country that experience these kinds of issues, and it shouldn't be that way. Boiled water notices for drinking water affects approximately 40,000 households. Beaches are closed due to wastewater discharge. People are getting sick, approximately 34,000 per year, because of drinking water. And often we see in this area and up in Auckland, no swim notices at beaches. And it leaves many Kiwis around the country thinking, why is it like this? Should it be like this? In fact, ours is a country that has natural resources and access to some of the best and cleanest water. But surely things could be better when it comes to drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. The next steps in the government's plan to fix this problem, which has been languishing for the last 2 decades, is to move towards a nationwide model that will benefit every community. This is an all-in approach that will require legislation, and it will require every council to be a part of a quantum shift in the way that water services are delivered. We do not accept, this government does not accept, that the status quo is good enough, so we'll work towards a solution that will create a financial, sustainable model to fund asset management and Three Waters infrastructure investment that will improve health and environmental outcomes, save ratepayers money while improving water service delivery, and improve Te Mana o Te Wai benefits to fresh water first and foremost. We've confirmed that 4 multi-regional entities will be established and they will have the balance sheet capacity to raise the level of investment required to fund water's infrastructure and capacity for the next 30 years and beyond. Councils in many instances are making ongoing trade-offs with other priorities for the cost of their water's infrastructure. Independent analysis has shown that approximately 120 to 185 billion is required for investment over the next 30 years. As a responsible government, we cannot ignore this stark reality, and we certainly can't be expected to throw money at the status quo because it's not working to the best of its ability. I've worked over the last 4 years with the sector. The case for change is strong. It's compelling for drinking water. Over 20% of all water suppliers serving 100 people or more don't achieve full compliance with New Zealand drinking water standards. Approximately 30 models were considered, but none of them delivered the range of benefits that we're proposing in these reforms. No one council can fix the scale of the challenge by themselves, and neither can they ignore the substantial benefits that this reform brings. To highlight this point, 64% of councils don't have water revenues to meet the full costs of running water services and assets. Ultimately, the changes I propose will deliver for ratepayers, which is a key consideration. The 8-week consultation period that was asked for by Local Government New Zealand on behalf of their sector has highlighted some constructive feedback, and a part of this announcement is the establishment of a working group that will provide further thinking on the governance, representation and accountability arrangements. This is a long-term challenge that no one has been prepared to tackle across governments. And I believe that our government has been elected to address some of the very significant long-term challenges. They may not be popular, but they are necessary. And during this particular time, Three Waters is one of the issues that has languished for far too long. When I think about the nature of this challenge, in fact, the easiest thing to do would do nothing, but I'm not taking that pathway. This is a hard issue. It's a complex set of challenges. And I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, just because it's a hard issue. We need to act, and we need to do something that will change the way that we invest and provide water services so that every community across the whole country can benefit. The status quo is no longer an option, and I think the sector have recognised that as well. When I think about the long-term challenges in relation to freshwater reforms, housing, climate change and child poverty, much of the infrastructure that is provided through waters can underpin regional growth and opportunity, greater resilience towards the impacts of climate change, and the opportunity in terms of a workforce development pipeline, economic development. We can't keep turning away from issues that mean future generations have to bear the cost. That's why we need to do something now. It is urgent and it must change. Let me come back to some of the reasons why. And again, I point you to our website for those who have taken an active interest in many of the alternatives that councils have offered up. We've tested about 30 alternatives. They are all a part of our regulatory impact statement, but none of them deliver the comprehensive benefits that our approach is taking. But it is important for the sector to see that we have gone through that process. I believe that by establishing the working group to look at the governance, representation and accountability arrangements, that is a continued signal to the sector that we must remain engaged on a really challenging issue. At the end of the day, when we go for a holiday, what we want to make sure is that we have the assurance of clean drinking water, the ability to swim in our local lakes, streams and oceans, beaches, and the confidence of knowing that the burgeoning cost of funding infrastructure that is so critical to our regional growth and development can be met without the taxpayer having to fully fund. The opportunity to do this change will deliver legacy benefits for New Zealand, and I'm pleased that we're able to make this decision today. Happy to take questions.
Minister,
one at a time.
Minister, this was originally a...
So I'll just take one
question. Exactly, Minister, how you intend to have the councils participate in the all-in model that you've referred to, and will that be done through mandating legislation?
Councils will be able to reflect their views through the working group that will be established, and as a part of our proactive release of information, we have summarised much of the feedback that's come to us over the 8-week period. That working group will lift up the common themes that have concerned the sector in the way that this reform is framed.
Will there be a mandate in the legislation? I mean, the working group, you're talking about governance and accountability. How is ownership addressed? Because the councils have very vocally expressed their views, some of them. How will that be dealt with in the legislation? Will it be mandated? How do you get the councils on board?
Well, we've always said to councils through this process, because it is a public ownership model, that while they own their assets, debt and liability individually, the new model will enable them to co-own assets across the entity, and will require legislation to achieve that.
Co-own as opposed to
because their
collectively?
assets will be alongside other councils, and as a group of councils, they will be able to continue to own that collective group of assets within the entity.
You also asked my question about mandating. Will there be a mandate in that legislation? How are you going to ensure the all-in model?
Legislation
is a mandated decision.
So after originally being, after originally being the opt-in model, what has changed for you to force councils to be the all-in process?
Yeah, when we started this conversation right at the beginning, and that's some 3.5 odd years ago, there was an inaccurate picture, in fact, very variable picture about what was understood by this in terms of the state of the health of the Three Waters network. So to initiate the conversation in the right way with councils, we said that this is a voluntary opt-in approach to trying to understand the extent of the problem. Why we needed to take that approach is because we needed councils, one, to recognise that we really didn't have a good picture of the system, that we needed more information, that councils held a lot of that information. And in order to come up with a solution that was as close as possible to something that would work for all of New Zealand, we needed councils to continue to be engaged. At the point at which we found just how dire the situation was, and there are numerous reports that have been put to the DIA website, we recognised, as did local government, that the case for change was compelling. The more we found out, the more we realised that something had to change. And that at that critical point, and at the point where we started to release the density of information, it was evident that to ignore the state of the water infrastructure would be irresponsible.
Does the scale of the council's opposition factor into this?
I think as we analyse the feedback from councils, and again, this is a 4-year conversation, much of the feedback we had already heard from the sector. I guess the 8-week period brought everything to a very sharp point where the volume and the extent of feedback was very accentuated. But it didn't really change in terms of substance. The issues around governance and representation, I think that was, again, a signal to us that more could be done in that area. That's why we're establishing the working group. There were some mistruths and disinformation out there, which I won't go into, but that wasn't helpful. And it would be fair to say that several councils were very well engaged on this issue, and some had just come to this issue over the past few months.
And what would you say to those? And what would you say to those who say this is an asset grab?
It's not. Councils own their assets now. They will continue to own assets alongside other councils within the entity.
Your opening speech, you outlined a number of shortcomings of water assets in the past. Is today and this new legislation is this an admission or an accusation that councils have failed in their water responsibilities?
I think it would be fair to say that 2 decades of underinvestment in water infrastructure shows that this is a systemic, long-standing issue that hasn't been addressed. To apportion the blame of any one council in a single point of time, I don't think is helpful. But to actually recognise that there has been systemic underinvestment, and as I pointed to in my speech, 64% of councils don't have water revenues to meet the full costs of running water services and their assets. And so that continues to demonstrate the continual trade-off that councils have had to make over a number of years, which is why we're in the situation we're in.
Can you outline the main thing, or just one of the major things that's changed in that eight-week consultation, from where you outlined where you saw the direction to now? What's one of the major things that the feedback has changed?
I think let me say what the feedback has affirmed. The case for change is strong, and that there is a general agreement across the sector that the status quo cannot remain. The second thing is that in terms of feedback, so much of which is constructive, that we've recognised is the establishment of a working group to further refine the issues around governance, representation and accountability. And I include within accountability the issues around local voice. That has been a significant move forward and towards achieving reform, taking on board those issues. I'll come over here with someone.
Minister, what's the membership of this new group looking like? Where are you going to get people to sit on the group? Where are they going to come from?
They'll come from a range of councils, obviously a mixture of councils, metro, rural and provincial, because there is a specific interest there. Also, because of the nature of the representation arrangements from iwi as well. And we have already established groups who have steered through much of the heavy graft and thinking around the reform agenda, so we'll take from that pool as well.
So you talked a lot today about ownership and the fact that council will continue to own their asset. But throughout this process, a lot of the councils who have been concerned about it have been concerned about having control and influence over the governance arrangements. Will councils get that in the new governance arrangements? Because
well, that would be more of the same, wouldn't it? And we're not in that place. We need to change the way that things are being done. And as I say, this is a systemic issue. There has been 2 decades of underinvestment in the current system, and we can't have the current system permeated through the reform that I'm proposing.
Any way of influencing the governance of these arrangements?
Can you just repeat that again?
Sorry. So even once this new group has done their work, you think that councils will not have any particular say in the governance of these new assets?
In fact, the reason why we're establishing the joint working group, which was a result of the 8-week consultation period, is to continue to work with councils around refining the issues to do with governance, representation and accountability. Included in that is local voice. I'll just move over here and then come over.
Minister, who will make decisions about water charges by these 4 authorities? Will councils be able to block any move towards water charges if they have ownership and control?
The water service entity ultimately is going to take on board that role. But let's be very clear, the benefit of the reform that we're proposing is to aggregate the assets, debt and liability to be able to fund and invest into water infrastructure investment.
How can you say that councils retain ownership and control if they can't even stop their own assets from charging them for water?
Well, let's be really clear. One of the gaps in the current system is that there is no standardised pricing for water, and we don't have any economic regulator to actually smooth some of the pricing. So that is a part of the reform agenda. Those who have been following our considerations is once we made the decision around scale, and then the next set of decisions which I'm announcing today, what also gets factored in is the work around economic regulation, and that will deliver a significant benefit to ratepayers.
And does this agreement...
One more on cost and then I'll move.
Does this announcement today include the compensation payments which you had talked about in previous proposals?
We didn't frame anything of that nature. What we had was an incentive package that would make very clear no council would be worse off in terms of things like stranded overheads, that there would be a better off component of the package, and that ultimately one of the key things that we wanted to ensure is that the overall that the reforms were aligned to the future role and function of local government. So it comes as a whole package.
Those incentives are still in place. You're not going to take those away.
I'll just come to someone who I haven't asked before, and that's at the back by the...
Can I just ask you to clarify your response to Luke when you said that continued council ownership or governance of the water entities would be more of the same, if they had direct governance of the water entities, it would be more of the same Because the reason that you and DIA have given for separating out the governance is balance sheet separation. It's not that councils have been making bad decisions, it's the fact that there isn't enough debt-raising abilities on the council's own balance sheets to invest in entities. Is the issue, what you're saying, the issue is really that councils are poor decision makers, or is the issue that councils don't have the fiscal ability to make the right decisions?
The issue is that the way in which councils are reliant on rates is inadequate to be able to service their own region, but actually the scale of investment that's required by council and then aggregated up across all councils is too much for any one council anyway. But when I think about the reform program and the creation of these water service entities, having a professionalised governance board will ensure that there can be absolute focus on being able to undertake asset management and infrastructure investment over a long period of time in a very strategically aligned way that will support the broader contributions of what councils are thinking about and contributing to.
And on ownership, obviously the whole reform package has been designed so that you don't answer the question of who owns the actual water itself. How long do you think New Zealand can afford to not answer the question of who actually owns water?
Well, this has been the case for a long period of time. I mean, at the end of the day, the reform that I'm working on is to ensure that we have an efficient use of water, that the quality of drinking water is absolutely key. So too is the discharge of water back to its natural environment. It's about water quality, efficiency and use, the ability for ratepayers to have confidence that we have an affordable system in place to enable them to get good service. And I'll just go at the back and then I'll move.
Ai te minita kaore ngā kaunihera I te whakae tonu ki tēnei o ngā kaupapa, hea tāu ki a rātou, ki te hunga whakahe?
Ko te tino nako o etihi o rātou e whakahe ana, ko te āhuatanga o te noho tahi o ngai Māori ki te taho o ngā kai kaunihera. Ki tōki nei whakaaro, hea hau tēnei, mehe mea kāro atu, kāro pu atu, ki te tino kaupapa e whai ake nei e au, ko te ora o te wai, te tuatahi, tuarua, kia toha atu I nei wai ki te katoa hei painga mo a rātou nei whānau, a rātou nei hāpori. Atu I tērā, kia kaua e wai hōtia mā te kore pūtia hei kukume I ngā āhuatanga ki te whakaora I ngā paipa kei I toha atu I ngā wai. E tērā.
Minister,
Kia hati kōrero a ngā iwi ki a koe mō tēnei kaupapa?
E ata whakarohia tonu rātou. E tihi, e tino kite, e tino marama ana te kite I ngā painga kei roto I ēnei tinihanga. Mo e tihi kei te ata whakarohia. Engari atu I tērā, ko tā rātou whakapai, me kahana tātou ki te hiki ki te hāpai ngā hiahia o tērā kaupapa mō te mana o te wai. Kua kuhu mai tērā I roto I tēnei o ngā mahi.
Noa I rā pātai, kua kaha tātangi te kāwanatanga e te āpiti hana e tahi o ngā kaikaunihera me te ki, kaore rātou e whakaana ki tō mahi ngātahi ki te mana whenua. Whakamaramakia mai hā te hua o te mahi ngātahi me te mana whenua.
Kei tua atu I ēnei tinihanga tērā hiahia. Ne? Mehe mea ka whakaro ake ki nā take tiriti me te aue o ngā iwi, ngā hapu, ngā mana whenua ki tā rātou ake hāpori. Ko tā rātou tino hiahia kia mahi ngātahi kia aro whānui ake ki ngā painga. E tihi o ngā kaunihera e uana tērā, e pupuru ana tērā o ngā hiahia, e tihi kāre e tāia. Ko tāku nei, kua kuhu mai tēnei hiahia ki te katoa o te nā painga e kite nei e au mō tēnei kaupapa.
Koe e pāna ki ngā wai o te hiko o te ika me te kore taia te inu I e rā wai, kua kōrero hoki koe mā ngā marae e nei kaupapa e whakahaere. Engari ka pēhea mo e rā hapori, kua kati ngā kuaha o e rā marae ka aha rātou.
Well, me ata whakarohia anō. Me ata whakarohia anō. Ko te wai he taonga mō tātou katoa. E kore mo te kotahi, e kore mo te hāpuri kotahi, e rā atu āhuatangi engari, me ata whakarohia ki te noho ngātahi kia ata tirohia, kia ata whai I ngā kaupapa hei haumaru I ngā hiahia o te hāpori, Māori mā Pākehā. Okay, I'm gonna come to someone I haven't come to, then I'll loop back around.
Is the divide between councils and government now simply too big to bridge? How are you going to resolve this?
Actually, we value our relationship with local government. We have had a very constructive relationship all the way through this, even though it's a difficult issue, and that's demonstrated in the Memorandum of Agreement that was announced at the local government conference, which set out a way of working on this very difficult and challenging issue. But it was also demonstrated in the announcement today and the creation of the working group to continue to work constructively in the areas that can make a difference, an improved difference to the way in which the nature of the concerns that have been reflected from local government can continue to be refined within the program.
One of the criticisms is also
we're putting forward
the number of entities. Did you consider at all increasing the number of entities? Why not?
Debate has passed. I mean, ultimately, Cabinet made a decision based on, I think, at the time of consideration for the New Zealand context, between a 3 or a 5 entity model. It is fair to say that we tried to understand what the benefits of aggregations within that realm would be. Politically, that seemed to be the range of entities that would also for the local government sector. Now I'm going to come back around to people who haven't come to Joe.
The $120 to $185 billion estimate has landed at $185 billion. What's the basis for that?
Oh, that was based on some modelling done by Wix, and as you'll be aware, Joe, that was peer-reviewed by Ferris and Becker in terms of the nature of that modelling. There are some caveats around that in terms of climate change and other factors, but that's been the range that we've landed on. I think it would be it's too stark to ignore that is the extent of what has been forecast for investment into the waters infrastructure, which again comes back to the reason why the government has made the decision that we've made today, because if we don't change the status quo, there may well be going forward into the future a real expectation that every time an individual council cannot afford the deficit for infrastructure investment, that the government will pay for it. And my proposition is really that if aggregation can help us find a financially sustainable pathway to invest in asset management and infrastructure, we should be taking that pathway.
For the jobs guarantee, how long does that stand for? Are we talking 1 year, 2 year, longer?
For the transition period, and this will be quite a critical working component of our transition team. At the local government conference in July, one of the key signals that we gave to the sector that was reflected in the Memorandum of Agreement was the assurance to those currently working in the water sector that they would be in the transition, that those issues would be a part of our a key work program. And we want that to be a signal that it's really important with that amount of investment forecast over the next 30 years, we should grow the workforce development pipeline here in New Zealand. We shouldn't walk away from it.
Can you lay out the details?
What's the number? How many years are we talking? What is that transition period?
Oh, for legislation to be stood up at 1 July 2024, but for over the working period of the transition team, which could align to the legislative period, roughly up to 3 years.
Lay out the details of the mandating, because there's nothing mentioned in any of the PR about how it's going to work.
Sorry?
Can you talk a little bit more about the mandating and the legislation, what the dates are, and I suppose your message to councils who have expressed their opposition to being forced into this process?
Yeah, councils do have a schematic of the forecast period for transition and legislative period. But again, I'm happy to come back with a level of detail on that time frame alongside the time frame for the working group.
Is the legislation going to be introduced?
The intention is at the end of this year.
Can you just say, please, to a message to councils? What is your message to councils who have expressed their fierce opposition to both the ownership model and the potential to mandate? what do you say to them and ratepayers?
Firstly, I want to say that this reform program is intended to benefit every community across the whole country. It is substantial and it is complex. This is also an opportunity for councils to work constructively within their multi-regional entities around some big strategic challenges and significant investments that are required to upgrade water's infrastructure, and that the opportunity through the working group to further refine the way in which governance, representation and accountability arrangements within this model is a signal that I've heard their concerns.
Can I just clarify, in terms of the legislation, if it's introduced by the end of the year and then presumably passed through the normal legislative phase, that would be at the point, once it's passed into law, that the mandate would take effect, is that correct?
Can you just go through that again, sorry?
So if there's a mandate contained in the legislation, would that mandate take effect once the legislation has been passed sometime next year?
Yes, like a legislative process. However, let me just ensure that those listening beyond this room to this debate, through the legislative process and the select committee process, there is an intention to ensure that we go through the full process, full public consultation, and ensure that there is a high level of engagement in the legislation. And again, as I have always done, I invite councils to engage constructively on this next stage.
Could you please go into some of that refining step? Is there any chance that all consideration that you'd move to a council-controlled style model? Would you consider that?
If you look to the website, because that was one of the models that was tested, there is more in-depth analysis around the council-controlled organisation, or a scaled-up version of that. However, that wasn't a model that we rested on as one that would achieve the nationwide benefits to the degree that we needed for the amount of investment that's going to be required.
Can you please go into some detail about how you plan to entrench public ownership of these entities, and whether with the 75% super majority, if it will be near impossible for future governments to undo?
Yeah, the intention is to ensure that there are layers of protection that will enable the safeguarding against privatisation and the protection of public ownership. They're probably higher thresholds than what are currently visible in the current system. So, you know, the opportunity to have a 75% of councils as a threshold, because they are the owners, 75% of those ratepayers within the region of the water service entity, and obviously having a 50-50 representation arrangement with iwi is a Treaty of Waitangi threshold against privatisation.
Earlier in your tenure as Minister, you said that you didn't want to become the local government minister for commissions when there was debate in Wellington about sending commissioners in. You've now effectively sort of sent in commissioners for water. Do you feel like your relationship with local government has fractured in that time, and do you feel like you've changed as Minister from someone who was quite keen on preserving a high threshold of local democracy to someone who is now taking something out of local democracy?
That's not the case, and you know it.
Minister, you said that the councils couldn't afford the $180 billion of investment. What makes you think the government, the central government, can afford it? Because that's more than 50% of GDP, and that would actually breach the current Public Finance Act if you were to take on that extra debt and spread the cost out over.
The step won't attribute to the government balance sheets the size and scale of the entities, which is why we thought carefully about the benefits of aggregation alongside the other priorities that the government had, enabled the credit rating nature of these entities to be able to debt finance into infrastructure. And again, the technical advice is here, but we'll leave it for another time, because what we have is a range of considerations around how aggregation, the governance arrangements around the establishment of the water service entities enable the credit rating facility of these entities to be able to finance into infrastructure.
I don't understand how if these assets and this debt is effectively guaranteed by the Crown, how does that not increase the net debt of the Crown?
They won't be on the Crown's balance sheet. and they won't be on the council's balance sheet. They will sit on their own balance sheet, which is why the governance arrangements, as DIA officials have pointed to previously, became quite an important part of the considerations.
Straight through those to the Crown.
Well, we have undertaken an analysis and commentary back from Standard & Poor's on the governance structure that we have proposed, and we have other advice. That is not parallel to what you're saying.
Do you have advice to say that this does not breach or will not breach the Public Finance Act? Because on the face of it does.
Oh, look, I'll come back to you on that, but that is not something that has not been a part of this, because this is not a part of the government's balance sheets.
Ngā te hunga kaikiri he nui rawa te mana e hoa tingi ana ki ngā iwi. He aha tāu ki a rātou? Ka taia koe te whakaitu tērā i te reo me te reo Pākehā?
Pātai mai anō?
Ki te hunga kaikiri e mea ana he nui rawa te mana e hoa tingi ana ki ngā iwi. He aha tāu ki a rātou?
He noho orite te mana. Heoi anō ko te aronga whānui ki ngai Māori, ki tēnei o ngā kaupapa, e hara mō te tangata kotahi, engari mō ka aro atu ki te ora o te wai, hei painga mō ngā hāpuri katoa, ka kuhu mai ngā whakaaro e pāna ki te mana o te wai me ngā whakahaeretanga. Kia manatia i ā rātou nei hononga ki ngā wai. Engari, e hara mō ngai Māori ana ki ngā painga, mō tātou katoa. Ko te whakaaro o e tihinga whakaaro kaikiri kāre au e tino āhei ana e tino tautoko i ā rātou nei whakapai.
Kai ana ki te whakautu i roto i te reo Pākehā hoki?
Yeah. Do you want to ask in English and I'll answer in English?
What do you make of racist groups saying that this is too much power has been handed over to iwi?
I think what we have is an opportunity for iwi to sit at the table in terms of decision making around water. When we think about iwi aspirations, those aspirations are to see the improvement of fresh water, the ability to exercise their kaitiaki responsibilities for their community, their hapori, and the ability to ensure that te mana o te wai aspirations extend beyond people and communities and to the natural environment and the water resource. And I think those are all positive contributions to the conversation we're having about water infrastructure investment, because we may well see more nature-based solutions in very practical ways that would be a long-term intergenerational shift in the way that we think about water infrastructure.
You mentioned there were about 30 other options that were in the RIS for this. Why haven't you, or did you even consider any of those other options that might have been more of a compromise between you and councils? Why did you go for this option, which seems to have angered council so much?
Because we needed to ensure that the big challenge of having a balance sheet, a separated balance sheet that could fund infrastructure with some substantial costs was a key consideration, ensuring that we had a public ownership model, ensuring that we had nationwide benefits from a model that we were proposing, ensuring that the affordability challenges that go right back to the ratepayer could be demonstrably beneficial, and ensuring that the health and environmental outcomes could be achieved and bespoke to the New Zealand situation, that we could build in te mana o te wai aspirations. Those are all the range of considerations that we had factored in as we looked at other models.
And so is local democracy being undermined?
Not at all. I think what local democracy is being enhanced, because ultimately, as I started my opening remarks, ratepayers want to know that they can have the assurance of safe drinking, reliable drinking water. They can go to their local beaches without a swim notice. That they don't have to worry every time there's a big event that slush is running into their waterways because of damaged infrastructure. We've had years and years of underinvestment in water infrastructure, and now's the time to do something about it. And if that doesn't speak to the heart of democracy, which is about having thriving communities, flourishing communities, the ability to fund into areas that are critical to those flourishing communities, I don't know what is.
In terms of the water entities borrowing, using debt to invest in infrastructure, the income they get presumably then comes to the councils to pay the finance costs of that?
The income will go straight to the water service entities.
Councils. Will councils be paying them for providing services to their community?
No. The water service entities will be the provider of the services. This is a very different way of thinking about it. And I think that's been some of the challenge with explaining it, because I think several views that have got mixed up on the debate have thought that the transfer of obligations are just the transfer of existing obligations into these scaled up entities. It's a very different way of thinking about service delivery.
But just so I can clear, does that mean individual households will be paying a direct water charge to the water entity?
Much in the same way that they are, but they will have the added benefit of economic regulation that will ensure that as consumers, as ratepayers, they are getting good quality services. And what we have seen from around the world is that economic regulation makes a critical difference and a positive benefit to consumers and ratepayers in terms of what they're paying, enabling equity, but ensuring that service delivery alongside what they're paying is at a high standard. And we need that. We need that, quite frankly.
One final question. Do you think there's a risk that councils will go on an investment strike which could cripple the government's housing growth plans? Now, the councils will have to wait 2 or 3 years to work out what this means for their balance sheet.
Well, thank you for that question, because one of the reasons why we need change in this area is it's very difficult to deliver on our housing priority ambition if that is the attitude that councils are taking. However, what I can say is that by moving into this space, it will severely support some of the regional economic development aspirations, such as the provision of housing, because often in key areas, infrastructure has been a handbrake to accelerating housing opportunities. And we only need to look to some areas where they have come to the government to fund the infrastructure component of their housing to enable the housing ambition of the government. Okay, thank you.